What's up, metalheads, veggie eaters, and bloodmouths alike? It's me, Emma, the heavy metal lawyer. I've been vegetarian since I was 4 years old. And I am hardly alone among metalheads in refusing to eat meat, so let's take a quick stroll through the history of metal and see where vegetarianism and veganism have popped up. Heavy metal has its origins in the psychedelic hard rock sound coming out of the hippie movement. Despite modern-day associations between hippies and vegetarianism and veganism, the hippie movement was not wholly on board with not eating animals. And even those who did get on board did so pretty late, like Paul McCartney of the Beatles only became vegetarian in 1975. Grace Slick, lead singer of Jefferson Airplane, one of the earliest and most influential of the psychedelic hard rock groups, didn't talk about being a vegetarian until 1999, though it is unclear when she actually became vegetarian. A big part of why the hippie movement wasn't actually that big on vegetarianism or veganism was because the animal rights movement, which was the big driver of vegetarianism and veganism up until the 2000s, didn't really get started until the 1970s, specifically with the book Animal Liberation by Peter Singer in 1975. The argument was pretty simple. Almost all animals are capable of experiencing suffering, and thus there is a utilitarian argument to prevent that suffering as much as possible as long as it does not cause suffering to humans. This argument also lent itself to looking at vegetarianism and veganism as more than just a personal choice, but also a moral imperative. That perspective had a big influence on two music scenes in the 1980s, hardcore punk in the United States and crust punk in England. Starting with US hardcore punk, vegetarianism and veganism largely became popular within the straight edge movement, a movement of hardcore punk fans who chose to abstain from alcohol and drugs. Like Peter Singer's argument for animal liberation, the arguments of straight edge were also utilitarian and lend themselves to moral imperatives, that alcohol and narcotics harmed people, that society or corporations profited from that harm and thus encouraged the use, and thus straight edge punks had to take a stand, even if that made them out of step with the world, as Minor famously put it. Animal rights and hardcore punk could be pleas to rationale, like the song Cats and Dogs by Gorilla Biscuits, where vocalist CIV asks why we treat our pets like cats and dogs with such compassion, but then eat other animals. But other bands were less interested in trying to convince people and more interested in fantasizing about violent animal liberation, such as metalcore innovators Earth Crisis, who sing on their song All Out War, quote, "Keep on with your killing, your threats and your jokes. Just brace yourself for what's in store. Continue to flow with the closed-minded evil. Prepare for all-out war." And there's also Hare Krishna core, which, yeah, just Google Cro-Mags if you're curious. I really don't want to get into that one in this video. So straight edge isn't nearly as big as it was in the 80s and 90s, and thus the straight edge tied animal rights movement is not very common nowadays. There are still a few bands keeping this movement alive, though, like the appropriately named Vanguard, putting out the EP Rage of Deliverance in 2020, which, even if you're a bloodmouth, that's a derogatory term vegans have for people who eat meat. If you like metallic hardcore, you're going to want to check this out. Maybe it will brainwash you into not eating meat anymore. There's also the amazing World of Pleasure, just one of the best hardcore bands going on right now. Amazing anthemic songs, oftentimes with the tag, Animal Liberation, Vegan Domination. Anyways, across the pond to England and to crust punk. Crust punk was preceded by and overlapped with the anarcho-punk movement in England. Unlike fashion douchebags, Sex Pistols, anarcho-punk used their music and art to advocate for left-wing anarchism. And among the issues that were especially important for the movement was animal rights. The most famous anarcho-punk band was Crust, founded in 1977, though they didn't actually talk about animal rights that much in their music. Neither did the most influential band on crust punk, Discharge. But they did have those politics, and animal rights would start showing up a lot in crust punk lyrics in the form of opposition to animal testing. One important bit of context for my American viewers is that as bad as animal testing was in the US at that time, animal testing in England was far more unhinged. Not only was that a worthwhile evil to protest against, but the photos of the testing, especially of vivisections, were appropriately brutal subjects for metal album covers, as shown on the covers for Stop Vivisection by Any Means Necessary by Final Warning, Play Fast or Die by Electro Hippies, and Mince core band Agathocles' own creative spin showing a vivisection of a human on their appropriately titled EP, If This Is Cruel, What's Vivisection Then? Play Fast or Die by Electro Hippies was released in 1989 and included the track Vivisection Song, which definitely falls on the more Earth Crisis side of the lyrical spectrum, with the lyrics, I'll crucify you and watch you burn. Maybe it's the hard way, but you'll learn. What they need is welfare, free from torture, free from experiments and exploitation. The death metal nerds in my audience probably already know where I'm going with focusing on Electro Hippies. The band included Jeff Walker, who would go on to found one of the most important metal bands of all time, Carcass. While Carcass's lyrics were famously focused on medical rhetoric for gore, the band has a lot of connections to animal rights, which might surprise some of their fans. Jeff Walker and Bill Steer, the two constant members of Carcass, are both vegetarians and were both involved in hunt sabotages. Again, some context is needed for my American fans. Hunt sabotages were usually focused on fox hunting, which is basically glorified dog fighting, except somehow even worse because it's being done by pretentious British assholes on horseback. If you couldn't tell from their participation in direct action, Carcass were not half-assed in their support for animal rights. They also played benefit shows to raise money for these hunt sabotages. And you'll see this amazing show, which had an admission price of £3, or about $4 at the time, also featured some other important crust punk, grindcore, and death metal bands, Extreme Noise Terror, Sore Throat, and Bolt Thrower, respectively. Like death metal, grindcore in England came out of the crust punk scene, generally considered to have been started by the Napalm Death album Scum in 1987. While the band had entirely different members and an entirely different sound when they put out Harmony Corruption in 1990, the one constant with this ever-evolving band has been their politics, including on animal rights. That ranges from the anti-animal testing song Display to Me off their second album, From Enslavement to Obliteration, to the cover of the song People Pie by industrial group Slab on their mini album Resentment is Always Seismic. Unfortunately, a commitment to animal rights in death metal and grindcore is generally restricted to those bands associated with the crust punk scene in some way or with the straight edge hardcore scenes, like melodic death metal band Heaven Shall Burn. There are some notable exceptions, though. The bassist and vocalist of death metal band Noroth, who put out one of the best albums of 2021, Harbinger, is vegan. Death grind band Cattle Decapitation is famously focused on animal rights. Brutal death band Aborted has a drummer who is vegan. While we may not be as in your face as some punk bands like Propagandhi, there are lots of vegetarians and vegan metalheads out there proudly chowing down on our tofu scrambles before donning our faux leather jackets and going to the show. So like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments.